Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of my Cedar Point Recreation Park. Last time we worked on building out the station for Rougarou, and today we're going to stick in the same area and look at Millennium Force. One of my favorite rides in the park, and definitely what turned out to be one of the longest and most complicated station builds that we've done so far. Not just for the station itself, but everything that kind of goes around with it. We wound up doing a significant amount of track rework on Millennium Force compared to some of the other roller coasters that we've been revisiting. As I mentioned last time, we decided to expand the space taken up by the railway to give us a little bit more room for the turnaround at the end of the ride and a little bit more space for our queue. As we've finished working on the park layout, there are some areas of improvement that I wanted to tweak here with Millennium Force. In addition to the turnaround, I was able to move the station back a little bit to give us a little bit more room for our new and improved lift hill. I got some suggestions in the comments from way back when to look into here, and ultimately decided to stick with the steep slope up so we could keep the cable lift and use a vertical drop down, which the Giga Coaster can't do natively, but we're using some dummy track here like we did with Top Thrill Dragster. Unfortunately, the Giga Coaster cars don't have proper sprites for this, but I don't think it's going to be a huge deal. At least this way, the first hill does not look like a big triangle, which I think was the worst part about it that I really wanted to get fixed. I'm still not very happy about the two large camelbacks that go over the railway and the path and the river next to each other here. We really need much larger slopes than what the game has, so they don't look so blocky, but I don't think there's anything we can really do about it. On the other hand, making the lift hill a little bit taller does allow for a faster speed through the layout, so I think the coaster is flowing a little bit more nicely now, which is pretty good. I'm happier with the layout. Again, it's not perfect, but I don't know if there's really a good way to get Millennium Force perfect with the limitations that RCT has, so all things considered, it's not too bad. As far as the station buildings themselves go, worked on this for a little bit, and I'm not very happy with the design that I came up with. The real life station buildings have a very cool, pseudo-futuristic, industrial-looking aesthetic. And sometimes it works really well, like on Raptor, as I mentioned a couple episodes ago, but I couldn't get something I liked with the Millennium Force buildings. Something about them just looks a bit too plain and too blocky. The textures aren't quite right, something like that. So I guess I need to come back here at some point and do some tweaks on them to get them to look a little bit nicer, even if they're not going to wind up looking perfectly accurate to the real thing. I don't think I'm quite a huge fan of the way that they turned out. One problem I think I have is that the station is actually a little bit too high off the ground, which makes the supports for the station buildings look a little bit weird. They're far too long. So I don't know if that can be solved by adding some more stuff underneath the station buildings. It's really hard to see from photos and the Google aerial view exactly what they're supposed to look like under there. I'm going to have to get creative a little bit later on when we come back to fix those up. This is especially noticeable with the transfer track. You can sort of see a good view of the transfer track from Google Street View if you look at the view from the actual road that goes past the park. And you can tell that it's not nearly as high off the ground as I have it here. I don't know if it's too late to fix this without destroying and rebuilding the stations, but then again, maybe that's something I'll want to do if I don't like them this much. I don't know. I'll have to think about it. I've already had to destroy and rebuild parts of the track this episode a few times, so I guess it wouldn't be the worst thing if I had to do a few more. Although every time I do it, it does nuke my park rating since there's 1,000 guests waiting in line and they all get very upset. With all the scenery and decorations around my Millennium Force, it's got the highest excitement rating in the park, just barely beating out Gemini somehow. I don't know how Gemini is still so high. But everybody in the park is lined up to ride Millennium Force. Completely filled the queue at a couple points, which is very funny to me. Speaking of queue, that is one of the areas of this build that I did wind up really liking how it turned out. The orientation of the queue area itself between the back of the track is kind of diagonal, so the queue line is very squiggly, which looks a bit weird when you're just using the vanilla game queues. But after I replaced that with some base blocks and invisible queues and threw some awning over top, I think all that wound up looking super nice, and I'm actually really happy with the way that turned out. We are a little bit crammed for space over here. I had to move the railway again, which now is overlapping a bit of the road that goes past. And we're going to have to move the coastline out a few tiles, I think, which is going to be annoying because that's going to be a lot of work later on. But as always, it's better to find these problems out as early as you can, so it's less effort to fix them. And of course, we're also doing a considerable amount of custom support work for Millennium Force. Tried a couple different things, but I wound up going with the launched freefall ride for our main lift supports, which I think wound up looking the best. It's narrow enough that you can place them pretty close to each other and they won't look too awkward from the isometric point of view, like the steel walls can do sometimes, as you can see if you look at the supports on Corkscrew. But I think the combination of freefall tower for the vertical supports and the inverted impulse coaster for the horizontal supports wound up fitting the lift hill really well. I'm pretty happy with this. Especially with the new lift hill shape, everything looks pretty reasonable. It's definitely recognizable as Millennium Force, I would say. There are a few other problematic areas with the custom supports, such as the first turnaround. Used a combination of the steel lattice work there and some single rail supports and some post fences. Very tedious work. And there's a couple other places on the ride that I'll have to come back to, especially over the turnarounds on the middle of the ride, where I didn't really go into too much detail with the supports there. Most of that part of the track is going to be covered by trees anyway, so it's not going to be a big deal if I leave out some of those supports regardless. But anyway, it's nice that what I thought was going to be a complicated part of the park here on the Millennium Midway with the weird diagonal orientation, I thought that it would be a complicated part of the park to work on and get it to look good. I think the fact that it's still quite wide has made things a lot easier to do. There's plenty of room to throw in some areas for flower beds and buildings and the locker station and everything. It might start to get a bit more cramped once we throw some of the buildings in here down, but there aren't a ton of them. It's mostly a lot of foliage and fencing and just open path. So I think it might work out okay, that it's not going to be too terrible to finish up once we get to our final details. There is quite a bit more tedious, busy work to do with smoothing out the edges of the path. We're going to throw down some scenery to make our diagonal path edges a lot nicer looking, and add some coaster track to make some fences. Not much looking forward to throwing all that down because there's going to be a lot of it, but I know that once I do, it's going to be worth the effort because it always looks really nice. But anyway, I think that's about all I want to talk about today. Bit of a longer episode, but this was definitely the longest build we've had so far for this stage of the project. I spent about 3 hours so far just for this episode to get these Millennium Force scenery bits done, and I would say it's still not quite finished. Like I said, I want to redo some of the station buildings, and I think I forgot to proxy out some of the queue leading up to the station. So still some more work to be done here. But I figured if I spent too much more on this, I'd probably go crazy. And I think it's time to move on to another coaster for now. And we can save the rest of the little tweaks here for later on in the project. But pretty happy with the way things are going so far. All things considered, knowing that Millennium Force is kind of a problematic coaster as far as RCT layouts are concerned. But that's going to do it for today. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and as always, if you've got any comments, questions, or suggestions, please let me know. Thanks for watching.